All right, so we left off talking about lipids last time in regards to um, being a macromolecule. You know, it's important for energy, for cells, for our bodies. We know it helps with cushioning our organs and orbitals of our eyes. And it's also important for making cell membranes, and it's done so through phospholipids. Also, lipids and fats are anonymous or synonyms. They can function as steroids. And so cholesterol can be converted into different types of steroids like testosterone and estrogen. These are hormones, as you know, important for animals anyway. We tend to think of testosterone in men, even though women also have testosterone and men have estrogen, but again, it's the various amounts of these different things. As you know, these steroids can help with androgens, making more muscular strength or hairy faces and all sorts of stuff in men, for instance. The testosterone can do that for both sexes, though. And so, anyway, let's talk about that. So, here's our triglyceride. We talked about that last time. This is how fats are moved around in the body. We call them saturated fats when you see a carbon filled up with hydrogen atoms. And then we call them unsaturated when you see a double bond between a carbon and we removed the hydrogen. So saturated means it's filled up with hydrogens. Typically speaking, unsaturated fats are normally better for you than saturated fats. That's because it remains in a kind of an oily state, while saturated fats tend to potentially lead to things like atherosclerosis and plaques that build up in your blood vessels. But it's more complicated than that because it also includes immune cells, things that are caused by the stress. And anyway, this is a plaque being formed. It's a more complicated than just eating fat. It's also an autoimmune kind of response that, or maybe you had some scar tissue from a little tear from the vessels, and then immune cells kind of form, heal it up, and then lipids get pulled in, and immune cells. And again, it's kind of a complex situation, but ends up forming this plaque that begins to close up the blood vessel. And if a plaque tears off, it can actually travel around in your bloodstream and go into parts of your brain and cause a stroke, for instance, or into your lungs and cause some serious problems there too. So again, trying to limit saturated fats and trans fats is important. And so these were examples of things that you want to avoid. So like, well, not all fats. I mean, obviously there's important fats as well, but things like margarine or trans fats or things that might have been used for cooking these donuts might not be particularly healthy, but more important fats you might find in, for instance, salmon. So again, butter would be better for you than margarine, even though it's a saturated fat, because trans fats are actually worse. But again, you're trying to limit saturated fats and particularly trans fats, and then there'll be some plant oils that might not be as good for you as others. Again, it's a lot more complex. Some seed oils are not as good for you as olive oil, but again, it's going to be, some of this is going to be discussed on other sources where you really need to take time to really learn about it. And then look at multiple sources, because there's a lot of biased information when it comes to nutrition as well out there. Now, cell membranes are made up of phospholipids, and this is a really important type of lipid. Here we can see that it helps to form a cell membrane. So this here is what we call the, well, this part right here is the hydrophobic side. This is the fatty tails. And here you see it's saturated, here unsaturated on that tail. And then up here we have what we call the hydrophilic head, the part that likes water. So this part is hydrophobic, these tails, and this part is hydrophilic, it likes water. And so what happens is it forms a cell membrane, where the parts that like water, that's the circle parts right here, those parts are called hydrophilic. That's the hydrophilic heads. They'll point towards the water. So this would be the inside of the cell. This would be the outside of the cell. And so this part in the middle is the fatty hydrophobic area. And so it forms this kind of soap bubble-like effect that form cell membranes, or even nuclear membranes, or the membranes of all sorts of organelles. Inside these lipid bilayers are also proteins that function like channels or doors that allow substances to enter and exit the cell. And then there's proteins also on the outside and carbohydrate linked proteins that help in cell communication. It gets really interesting and complex. But the main thing to take out of this is that phospholipids help form this lipid bilayer, this cell membrane. Let me see if I can provide a few more examples of that. All right, so we're going to, I found this video on YouTube that you should watch about phospholipids. And so anyway, let's see what they have to say, and then I'll add to it and pause it and add my 2 cents.
Phospholipids, much like the name suggests, are lipid molecules, a subgroup of lipids and fats. Lipids, including phospholipids, are soluble in nonpolar solvents, but are resistant to water. You know, when you try to mix water and oil, yeah, they don't like each other and never mix.
Phospholipids also have kind of a tadpole look to them. So here's the hydrophilic or water-loving end, and then here's the hydrophobic tails, the part that doesn't like water. Now, the interesting thing about phospholipids is there's actually quite a few different types. We'll get to that in a minute.
Molecule is a hydrophilic or water-loving phosphate group. The 2 tails are hydrophobic or water-hating fatty acid chains. Phosphate groups are made up of a central phosphorus molecule surrounded.
So this is a phosphate atom, and then these are oxygens, and so that means a phosphate can hold 5 covalent bonds. That means they share electrons. And then and so here it has 4 oxygens around it. And then this oxygen has a bond with R. R means the rest of potentially different types of atom structures. So just realize that it's not just R is not an atom. It's actually kind of saying, almost saying the rest of the compounds that could be added to it. So it can represent quite a few different things. And you'll see that in a moment. Remember, oxygen holds 2.
And fatty acid chains are made up of hydrogen and carbon molecules.
So these are all saturated fats, by the way. So here's the carbons and hydrogens. Remember, carbon can hold 4 covalent bonds. Remember, these are shared electrons between hydrogen and carbon. Remember, hydrogen can only hold 1. So these are all saturated fats in this particular example. This part hates water, and then the head of the phosphorus group loves water.
When you use a glycerol molecule as a backbone.
Now this is just going to show you how complex it can get. This is a glycerol backbone, and then some phospholipids have a different backbone, and then they're going to have different R groups.
Combining the phosphate group with 2 fatty acid chains, and voila, you've got a phospholipid. Now,
so the main thing to get out of that, though, is this is the hydrophilic head due to the phosphorus. And there's a backbone, kind of like the triglycerides had a backbone as well. And then here's the fatty acid chains, the hydrophobic side of it.
You've got a phospholipid. Now let's go through the types of phospholipids. There are 2 main types of phospholipids based on the type of backbone they have.
So you can see quite a bit different structure in the backbone. This one has a hydroxyl group coming off of it. Here's an NH. So there's some differences, but the basic function will be similar, at least as far as we're concerned in Biology 100.
Glycerol phospholipids, where the backbone is made of glycerol, as we talked about earlier, and sphingophospholipids, where the glycerol backbone is replaced by a long-chain sphingosine. The hydrophilic phosphate group.
So the sphingosine have the nitrogen in it. Now, again, what I want you to make sure you understand is I'm not worried about you knowing that level of detail. What I'm trying to get you to understand now is just an appreciation of the complexity that these phospholipids can have. That's not an expectation, other than you realize there's a phosphorus group that loves water and fatty acid tails. and it's going to be important for making this phospholipid bilayer.
The hydrophilic phosphate group can also the choline, you've got a phosphatidyl
So here's-
choline.
So if you go back to this, remember this is where the R is, and then this just shows you what those R can mean. So look, in this case, the R represented all of this. That's what I was trying to tell you earlier.
You've also got a phosphatidyl ethanolamine, cardiolipin.
Well, here's two phospholipids. So look at all these different names. They're just different phospholipids that I wasn't even really aware of.
Phosphatidyl inositol, and all these others that I'm listing on the screen, which are a mouthful.
So it's really cool to see that and shows how complex some phospholipids are and ultimately cell membranes.
Great names to give your ex. A reminder of how annoying they were. Okay, so hydrophilic head, hydrophobic tails, and a ton of different types of phospholipids. But what do they all do? The main thing that phospholipids do is act as a primary component of cell membranes. Phospholipids put their heads together literally on the outside of the cell with their double tails together towards the inside. Another layer of phospholipids forming facing the opposite.
So remember, this is the water-loving side, and then this is the fatty acid tails. All these other organelles that you're going to see and we're going to talk about later all have this cell membrane or this plasma membrane. Obviously, the cell membrane would be just the outer cell. So these phospholipids are critical for making the cell membrane or these cellular membrane or these membrane organelles like the mitochondria and Golgi apparatus and so forth. The water is out here. There's water inside the cytoplasm. And so the hydrophilic sides, the parts that like water, face it. And then these tails form their barrier because they don't mix with water.
Creating a double-walled membrane, officially known as
it's not a wall, it's a membrane.
This bilayer assembly happens automatically because of the hydrophilic and hydrophobic properties of the phospholipids. This is what we call being amphipatic, and it causes phospholipids self-assembly. Cells need... So
cells can basically be disrupted and reform because of how phospholipids. So it's just kind of like bubbles running around in your bathtub. They'll kind of collide and form. So it's something similar to that.
Membranes to exist, and we need cells to be who we are. So now our funny-looking friends are not so funny-looking anymore. What they allow to go through and circulate the lipoprotein.
So anyway, I wanted you just to get kind of an idea of what phospholipids did a little bit better than what a non-animated picture will do. All right, so here's our phospholipid bilayer. I think that these will have some idea about it now. Also, fats and lipids, in their synonymous, that term, can make up the different hormones in our body and steroids, for example. And so here we have a cholesterol that can then be converted into things like testosterone and estrogen and so forth. Cholesterol is also found in the cell membranes between those phospholipid tails. It helps provide some fluidity to the cell membrane. So again, cholesterol gets converted into testosterone or estrogen through a variety of enzymes. So you might not know that cholesterol leads to testosterone or leads to estrogen. If you have higher amounts of testosterone in your body, you're going to have facial hair or a mane in the case of a lion. In the case of the female lion, also there's going to be high levels of estrogen, but she'll still have some testosterone running around too. And then this abundance of these different hormones probably does affect some of the degrees of things that we see that are masculine, you might in quotes call masculine traits or feminine traits. That everybody has a relative amounts of these different hormones in their body. The other thing is these hormones can also be taken in a synthetic form. So testosterone, for instance, can be used and formed in different ways to form anabolic steroids and give some athletes, I guess, an advantage. And of course, in some sports, depending on we call it cheating, depending on the type of sport and the rules of that particular agency. So, like if you're in a sport where they have strict guidelines on steroid use, and then you don't follow the guidelines of that agency, then they can ban you from that sport. The one thing I think people need to realize is there's a lot of what we call fake natties if you ever watch YouTube fitness, and realize some of your biggest famous stars are probably on some type of antibiotic steroid at some point. Think about it. You see a movie star with huge muscles, and maybe they only had a handful of months to prepare, and that contract is worth millions of dollars. I think there's a fair chance that those people are on some type of steroid, especially when they're completely beyond the normal. I think it'd be crazy for you not to think that somebody like The Rock hasn't used steroids. You know that Arnold Schwarzenegger used steroids. Sylvester Stallone has used some type of enhancing drugs, and he actually has been caught with them, taken them across the border. Anytime you see somebody with incredibly disproportionate size of strength, especially when they're getting older in life, there's a good chance that they're on some type of steroid at some point. You can decide whether or not it's cheating. You got to keep in mind that these people are dealing with millions of dollars in contracts, and if they don't look a certain way, they won't get that contract. So it's incredibly important. Or, they're trying to succeed in a sport, and they may try to get away with it using an enhancing drug and then stop using it before the competition. All those things do happen, and it's naive to assume that they don't. That doesn't mean hard work isn't involved as well. There are some concerns when you overdo steroids. There's a lot of huge bodybuilders that end up dying young, or WWE. All these different kind of things are often using some type of anabolic steroid. So again, there's some real pros, but if it's abused to the point, it can also cause some damage to your body, particularly your liver. Especially anabolic steroids that you swallow can cause liver damage, for instance. Now we're going to talk about protein. Proteins are really the primary, most important macromolecule in the body. Now, obviously, you need every one. Lipids are incredibly important. But when you think about the tens of thousands of enzymes that your body makes and all the structural proteins, and again, what's important for that? The DNA is the blueprint for making all these different genes that are responsible for all these different proteins. And then these proteins make up all these other compounds. They modify the lipids to make the lipids that you need for your body, or break down carbohydrates and so forth. So protein's essential. You've got to have a reasonable amount of protein in your diet to be healthy. Some people argue it's about 1 gram per lean body mass per day you should have to be healthy. And so having a low protein diet can be unhealthy after multiple years. So you need to think about good sources of protein when you eat. Again, proteins are going to be, as you're going to see, are made up of all sorts of amino acids. We'll get to that in a moment. The proteins are critical for animal life. They're going to be important for all these different enzymes. Anytime you see the word ACE, you know it's probably an enzyme. So here's a protease. That means it's an enzyme that breaks down proteins. And again, all enzymes are going to be made up of proteins. And what do enzymes do? They speed up chemical reactions, whether it's breaking down something or building something up. Enzymes are important for all that. And then when you talk about your immune responses and venoms and things that you might find in snakes, all that is protein as well. And then transporting proteins around your body and your blood, or transporting oxygen thanks to hemoglobin, all that is protein as well. So protein's so critical for life. Moving our muscles, that's protein. There's myosin and actin filaments that move past each other. Iron, proteins are important for storing iron, for instance, and collagen and fibrins, and anything you think of. Proteins are critical for forming the cartilage of the hair and so forth. Protein is so important. And then protein is made up of amino acids. Amino acids are the subunits of proteins. And we have over 20 amino acids. Some are going to be called essential amino acids. These are amino acids your body can't make, and you're going to have to eat it from a diet rich in protein. Good source of that is eggs, for instance. We're going to have sulfur proteins and things like that. So again, this is something where you should take time to learn about nutrition and to eat the right kinds of proteins. These are examples of amino acids. And again, there's around 20 different types. And then you find about 6 or so amino acids representing each of these different types. You have phenylalanine, asparagine, aspartic acid, and proline. These are all examples of amino acids. And so what you see for amino acids is an amine group and a carboxyl group. So the amine group is the nitrogen plus the 3 hydrogens. And remember, that come off as covalent bonds, like these lines represent shared electrons. And then the carboxyl group is basically a carbon atom and 2 oxygens. That's the carboxylic acid side of it. And so this will join with that, and I'll show that in a moment. So in other words, that's how we join a long chain of amino acids to make a protein. And then hopefully you remember from our previous classes about atoms, you realize that in each of these corners of this structure, there's a carbon atom, and then there's going to be hydrogens coming off of it and so forth. And so there's these different types of amino acids, and they all provide a different chemical structure that gives protein this unique shape to make these enzymes and structures and so forth. So amino acids join up through what we call a polypeptide bond. And we do that through dehydration synthesis. So here we are removing H2O. So removing the water molecule. And that joins these 2 amino acids together. So this carbon will join with this nitrogen, and then we'll have a dipeptide bond. And then we join more of these, and we have a polypeptide bond. And then ultimately this makes protein. So this is what your body does. It breaks down some type of protein by chopping up these amino acids, refiguring it and joining it into a human protein through dehydration synthesis or hydrolysis. Remember, when we bring water in and some enzymes, will break up the cow protein, and then we'll convert it into human protein. That's what your body does, or depending on whatever animal we're talking about. The basic same idea is the same. And ultimately, what I'm trying, the take-home message is amino acids are the building blocks for making proteins. And then when you have your protein in a proper structure, it can function as an enzyme, or it can join compounds together, or it can be used as like scissors cutting things apart, or all sorts of different things. Now, if you heat up a protein too much, like when you cook an egg and turn an egg white and it becomes all white, you denature it. And you do that with high heat, for instance. So that's one of the reasons why having too high of a fever is really dangerous, because it can denature the proteins in your brain and in your body so that the protein doesn't work anymore. Those enzymes no longer work, and then that's critical for what could kill you. So that's one of the reasons why we got to keep our fevers from not getting too high. Now, the whole point of your body trying to have a fever is to destroy bacteria or slow their growth down while your body has a chance to compensate. But when it goes haywire and we get too high of a fever, we can run into concerns about denaturing our own protein. So it's definitely a balancing act. But these misfolded proteins sometimes happen as well when the body's making it. It can result in things like Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease. And in some cases, misfolded proteins can function almost like a parasite, like a virus, cellular parasite, like Purons, and that can cause mad cow disease. So that's another kind of disease that can be caused by proteins. There's all sorts of different proteins. Some again are going to be structural, like this protein is necessary for making hair or silk in a spider web, or fibrin is important as a structural protein. So when you cut yourself, your blood's going to clot. That's what the fibrin's doing. So this is a red blood cell being caught. Some proteins are going to be globular in shape and function as enzymes. These are the ones that get really important for not overheating and denaturing, because if these enzymes don't function, then all the important cellular things that your body does won't function. So here's like an active site of the enzyme where it might cleave some atoms or whatever, or compounds, or join them together. That's enzymes do all sorts of stuff. And remember, enzymes speed up a chemical reaction. That means joining things together, separating them. Now, the last macromolecules, remember, it was carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, it's nucleic acids. That's our fourth important macromolecule. So when you eat other cells of other organisms, you're taking in their nucleic acids, you're taking in their DNA, and then making it into human DNA. So your body, through enzymes, will cleave up the DNA nucleotides from another organism, whether it be animal or plant. They'll cut up the DNA. Your body will reconvert it into human DNA for your cells when your cells are dividing and so forth. They'll take those nucleotides and join them and make DNA and or RNA. And so DNA, the whole point of DNA is to be found in the nucleus, and it functions as the blueprint for making messenger RNA that ultimately tells your body how to make protein that joins up with ribosomes. We call this central dogma, by the way. So DNA that's found in your nucleus is the blueprints ultimately for making protein, but it goes via RNA. And we'll get into that more in later classes. DNA represents deoxynucleotide. I'll take a second. I'm having trouble pausing it. Okay, hang on. I was getting a little tongue-tied and like quick talking. So DNA represents the deoxyribonucleic acid, and RNA represents ribonucleic acid, ribose nucleic acid. So deoxyribose nucleic acid means there's no oxygens, while ribonucleic acid does. We'll get into that in a little bit. I was getting a little tongue-tied, but ultimately, the nucleotides is what are the building blocks for this DNA and this RNA. You'll see that in a moment. But these are what tell cells in every organism how to make proteins. And we follow the same language. That's why genetic engineering works. That's why we think all life is related, because everything does the same thing with its DNA for the most part. So there are different nucleotides that make up DNA. And so this is the subunits of DNA. That's what we're getting into next. So remember how amino acids were a subunit for protein. Simple sugars were the subunits for carbohydrates. Remember, lipids were the subunits for different types of lipids. Well, nucleotides represent the subunits of DNA or RNA. Now, there's actually a 5-carbon sugar. So if it's DNA, it's lacking in oxygen. And if it's RNA, it has an extra oxygen. So DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. The ribose is the sugar. So remember, at each one of these corners is a sugar, or excuse me, carbon. So each one of these is a carbon. So this is a sugar. This is a 5 or 5-ring sugar. Well, 4-ring sugar with a little extension. And so this is a ribose. Now, the R, remember, the R represents the rest of the molecule. That's how I say it anyway. So if it's ribonucleic acid, it has that extra oxygen or this hydroxyl group. While in the case of DNA, it would just have a hydrogen. And that gets kind of important later, but for the purposes of what we're talking about, just realize DNA doesn't have that extra hydroxyl group. And I'm not even really that worried about that as much as you get an idea of what's going on. So all nucleotides have a ribose sugar. They have a phosphate coming off, and then they have this nitrogenous base. And the different nitrogenous bases determines what type of nucleotide it is. So you can interchange these different types of nitrogenous bases right here. So we have some that are called adenine. So adenine would be here instead. That's actually what this is being shown right here. So this is an adenine. And if you ever heard of adenosine triphosphate, they actually have this two other phosphates added to it, but we'll get to ATP later. So again, a nucleotide. If we remove this and put guanine in, that's the next nucleotide. The ribose and the phosphate still remain. Put the cytosine in, and you put the thymine in. So when we talk about DNA, we're talking about 4 nucleotides. This is kind of important. You have adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. Those are the 4 nucleotides that make up DNA. Now, when we talk about RNA, most of it's the same, except remember, it's going to have the hydroxyl group now on the sugar. And then we'll have adenine, you have guanine, you have cytosine. And instead of thymine, that we put a cross against thymine, we'll have uracil. So remember, RNA always has uracil instead of thymine. And DNA always has thymine instead of uracil. And then the only other difference is really is the hydroxyl group versus the hydrogen. And also DNA is using a double helix. We'll get into that in a moment too. So again, nucleotides are made of a 5-carbon sugar called ribose. So it is deoxy, some of it isn't. If it's RNA, it isn't. If it's DNA, it is. There's a phosphate group, and then there's one of these nitrogen spaces. Adenine, guanine, cytosine, or thymine for DNA. Adenine, guanine, cytosine, and uracil for RNA. So that's what's being shown in this picture here. RNA has ribose, and then DNA has deoxyribose. And then there's the thymine versus the uracil. RNA is single-stranded, and DNA is mostly double-stranded. And so how does DNA get double-stranded? Well, remember, it's basically going to be the same kind of chain facing each other, and I'll probably show a video on this, where guanine and cytosine always pairs up, and adenine and thymine always pair up. What these little dots represent is what we call a hydrogen bond. It's kind of a weak bond, but when they combine together, it forms this double helix, and I think it's worth showing a quick video on that. I'll show that in a moment. And then here's our single-stranded RNA. And we'll get into more about how that all works when it comes to making proteins, or functioning as a blueprint for protein. But DNA, we also call it a double helix. Here we can see, let me show you what's happening here. We got your ribose sugar, phosphate, ribose sugar, and then you notice your nitrogenous bases. And so we got one side facing one direction, the other side facing the other direction. And so we call one side at 5' end and the other side at 3' end. And that's just the direction that it's going. So like this is facing in one direction, this is facing in the opposite direction. And so you'll see that adenine always pairs up with thymine, guanine always pairs up with cytosine. And these bonds get fold apart and all sorts of stuff. This is the chemical structure of it. So here's our sugar, phosphate, remember the covalent bonds. And then over here is what it looks like if we were to have our outer shells, and you can see the whole atom. This picture is supposed to represent the outer shells of the atoms and the electrons and all that kind of stuff. So it shows you just a little bit how everything's filled up. Let's look at this a little bit further. All right, maybe this video can help you provide just a little bit more viewpoint.
The structure of nucleic acid, DNA and RNA. There are 2 main types of nucleic acid, DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, and RNA, or ribonucleic acid.
Remember, the deoxy doesn't have the extra oxygen, ribo does. Also notice it's a double helix. Remember, they're going in opposite directions. Like if your hand, one hand was going up and one hand's going down, and then they attach to these hydrogen bonds, and it's double-stranded. So that forms this helix, while single-stranded, as it sounds, is going to be without this other side.
Nucleic acids are large molecules made up of smaller molecules called nucleotides. The nucleotides in these molecules are linked together through covalent bonds.
Remember, covalent bonds means that they're sharing electrons on the valence shell, the outer shell of an atom, to fill up that outer
The bonds where
shell.
electrons are shared between atoms. Let's start by looking at DNA. The nucleotides that make up DNA have three parts: a phosphate group, a nitrogenous base, and a deoxyribose sugar, or 5-carbon sugar. The phosphate group consists of a phosphate bonded to 4 oxygen atoms, with one of the oxygens bonded to the number 5 carbon of the deoxyribose sugar. An important note here: the number 2 carbon of the deoxyribose sugar is bonded to a hydrogen atom. Carbon atom number 1 of the deoxyribose sugar is bonded to the nitrogenous base. There are 4 types of nitrogenous bases that can be found in DNA. Adenine, shown here, guanine, shown here, cytosine, shown here, and thymine, shown here.
See, adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. Probably worthwhile to practice pronouncing it even by your professor.
As you can see, adenine and guanine have double ring structures, and cytosine and thymine have single ring structures.
So you can see some of the differences already. So the adenine has the NH2. See, here's the double bond. Sometimes you don't see those pictures, remember? Here's nitrogen. Some pictures we don't see the carbon, but I drew it out here. Here's the double bond to oxygen. The carbon can hold 4 bonds. Oxygen can hold 2. Nitrogen can hold 1, 2, 3. So anyway, you can see the differences. So these have 2 rings, and these have single rings. The double rings should be known as purines, and the single rings should be known as pyrimidines. Hopefully I'm correct.
Adenine and guanine are called purine bases.
Yep, so here's our purines. And then over here's our pyrimidines.
And cytosine and thymine are called pyrimidine bases. DNA is a double-stranded nucleic acid, and its molecules take on a helical formation. Each
helical is kind of talking about that twisted shape, like if you had 2 strings wrapping around or 2 threads wrapping around each other. And then you'll notice that they go in opposite directions. At least they should be. Let's see what happens in this picture.
Helical chain has its phosphate sugar group toward the outside, and the nitrogenous bases facing inwards towards the nitrogenous bases of the other chain. Each of the bases on one chain is joined to the base of the other chain through either 2 or 3 hydrogen bonds.
I believe these sugars are pointed in the wrong direction for this example.
Thymine and adenine are joined by 2 hydrogen
But the main thing, just realize there's hydrogen bonds between these.
bonds, and cytosine and guanine are joined by 3 hydrogen bonds.
Yep, so that's important to know. Again, as an introduction to biology, I'm not really worried about getting all that. Just understand the A's are combining with T's, the G's are binding with C's, something about the basic structure.
Thymine and adenine are always a base pair, and cytosine and guanine are always a base pair. It's estimated that DNA molecules contain more than 100 million of these base pairings. And in one individual's body, the sequence of the base pairing is the same in every DNA molecule. So this sequence of base pairing is unique to that individual. DNA is often called the information molecule because it contains the master code needed to make various RNA molecules and protein molecules in the body. Now for RNA. The nucleotides that make up RNA are very similar to those that make up DNA. RNA nucleotides have a phosphate group with the same structure as in DNA. They have a 5-carbon sugar, but the number 2 carbon is bonded to a hydroxyl OH group instead of a lone hydrogen atom. With some height in the process of
And then
forming
got
different
uracil,
proteins
kind of
in the
mentioned
body,
that earlier.
of which we will cover in depth in a later video.
I wanted to show you this one also. This is showing you the alpha helix and helical. And what I want you to get out of this is the one picture of the other video didn't show you the direction that the sugars were facing. they made it look like they're all facing the same direction, but they actually face in opposite directions each. So we have a 3' and a 5' then. And so anyway, that's based on the number of the carbon, I believe. So in this case, we got the sugars pointing in this direction and then the sugars pointing in that direction. And then the other video didn't show that. That's probably not so important to you, but that means that they're opposite each other, as I mentioned earlier. So you have A's facing T's, G's still facing C's, but the actual strands are facing in different directions. Anything else I want to get out of this? Oh, I do want you to understand also that adenine adenosine triphosphate is an adenine. Remember we're talking about the adenine nucleotide. Let's make sure I'm recording. The adenine nucleotide, in this case, has 3 phosphates. So this is the fuel source for all living organisms, ATP. So here, I mean, there might be other ones too, but this is the primary one, ATP. So again, it's the same nucleotide, but now it has 3 phosphates. Anyway, I think that's the main gist I want you to get from this information. All right, I'm just going to give you just a little bit more detail than, well, this is more detail than you probably really need. Just pay attention a little bit to understand a little bit. And then, again, it won't be really hard tested on this or anything like that. But remember when we talk about the ribose sugars, well, this one has carbons, right? So remember these are carbons. And so we number them. This is carbon 1, so this is the 1', the 2', the 3', the 4', the 5'. Well, the 5' always has this phosphate group, and the 3' has this hydroxyl group, which is the OH up here. So we call the direction that has the hydroxyl the 3' then, and the direction that has the phosphate the 5'. So they're flip-flopped. So here's phosphate with a 5', and then you'll see the hydroxyl group. So this is the 3' then. And then you just flip it the other direction, and this is the 3' then, and this is the 5' then. So again, my point of this is just that it's like, imagine my fingers as the 3' then, and my palms are the 5' then. They would face opposite each other, and so that's what's happening in this picture. So I just want to make sure that that's clear, or more clear anyway than it was before. All right, so that's probably enough for DNA today. All right, so that's the DNA stuff. And you see the sugars going in different directions. We got the 5', and then we have the 3'. So the 3' then. And so this would be the 5' because that's the phosphate. And you just see where the sugar's pointing. That's how I've always thought about it, is the oxygen on that sugar. Anyway, and then the rest of these slides kind of talk about nutrition. Again, I'm not going to say that you're going to get an adequate amount of information about nutrition from these slides. Obviously, it's going to be something you're going to have to spend some time researching. There's going to be different advocates for different types of diets. Some of it's going to be from the USDA, some of it's going to be from different groups. And I think it's there's some real things that you need to kind of focus on. Some people would advocate for eating lots of vegetables, but there's also some evidence that some vegetables have various levels of toxicants in it, because plants don't want to be eaten, but a certain amount of it might be really good for stimulating anti-cancerous properties. So again, there's something that's good in moderation can be way too much in overkill. You can take too much vitamin A, for instance, and cause toxicity. So again, maybe as the Greeks say, and in regards to being an omnivore, because that's what humans are as an animal, we eat from a variety of food sources, all things in moderation, perhaps. You know, there's gonna be different types of diets out there. Some people are gonna advocate a keto diet or a low-fat diet or a low-carb diet. Ultimately, when it comes to losing weight, it's gonna be about the amount of calories you eat, and then making sure you have a reasonable amount of protein and then your basic nutrients. And your body probably can do the rest. But again, I'm not a dietary expert, but as I try to follow my weight loss journey, I'm focusing on having good protein and lowering my calories mostly, and not overdoing foods that aren't really particularly nutritious. You know, you're going to cut down on deep fried foods. You're going to cut down on foods that don't have a lot of potential nutrients, fried donuts, for instance, and things like that. Having a moderate amount of vegetables and fruits, particularly fruits, can be helpful. But again, I would argue that, again, everything should be in moderation, even if advocate for eating, you know, there's some people that advocate for a carnivore diet, but man, it's going to be a lot of it's going to be dependent on different things. And I would just leave it to you to try to figure these kind of things out or take a nutrition class and then listen to multiple sources and try to weigh things out. That's what I've been having to do as I try to figure out how I'm going to lose weight. And I have been starting to become successful. Again, amino acids are going to lead to proteins. This is a quick summary. Nucleotides are going to lead to DNA that results in chromosomes when it's all coiled up. We'll get into that more in other classes. Carbohydrates are things like starches and cellulose. Lipids are going to be stored in fat droplets and fat cells. And they're going to be used for steroids and cell membranes. There's going to be different types of explanations. Here's a food pyramid from 1992 to 2005. So this is what they were advocating, eating lots of carbohydrates, fruits and vegetables. So, and then you got your proteins and stuff like that. And then keeping your oils down. And remember, this might be very well true, but also we care about growing corn, but people worry about growing rice. And so the USDA may have an incentive trying to get people to eat this stuff. So overdoing any of this kind of stuff can put on weight. Calories are ultimately king, but we need to have protein in your diet. Now here's 2011, they changed it up a little bit. They may be stressing other things more so than other foods. So again, this is kind of an evolving area. And then here's 2011 that's currently being used, where breads are being limited a little bit more, and then more poultry and eggs are starting to have a higher. So again, look at these pyramids, but what they're trying to show you is now a more equal amount of each of these versus just huge amounts of carbohydrates. Again, I'm not advocating for any particular diet. I would argue for moderation, good proteins, keep your calories low. Make sure you have your essential amino acids, make sure you have your essential fats, limit alcohol, maybe take a multivitamin and call it good. Get your exercise. And so that's the one thing I'm really having to concentrate now as I try to lose weight, and I am losing weight, is keeping my calories in moderation. And that was something that I had to be more serious about versus binge eating and enjoying myself. I think that's going to make a pretty big difference. So I don't want to sit here talking about diets, even though there's times in my life I've been very fit and healthy when I watched my diet. But it's easy to ignore it and enjoy life too. So calories are king. Make sure you have some protein. Make sure you have some nutrients of various sources. Have your vegetables and fruits, but don't go overboard, I think, is what I would argue. But somebody else might argue to eat a lot of fruits and vegetables. Some people argue only carnivore. I don't think I do very well when I eat tons of bread and carbohydrates. I think I know my weight seems to be more stable when I focus on protein. So again, that's something you can figure out on your own. Make sure you're looking at nutrients labels and then how much of vitamins you're getting for any particular one. And it can be easy to overdo some of these. So just kind of look at them and think about it. Most people would argue if you have a well-balanced diet, you'll get most of the vitamins you need. And then look at nutritious facts on different things and see what you're getting. Realize energy drinks might have their pros and cons because there's lots of extra caffeine and those kind of things. Again, this is stuff that you should study on your own that you're not going to get from this biology class necessarily. Anything, thanks for your attention, and we'll move on to cells next. Take care and have a good day. Bye.